Hi, I'd like to thank you for purchasing this video. This video was created to assist you in servicing your own R1100RT so that you are not so reliant upon the dealers for routine service and minor repairs. If you do not already own one, I strongly recommend you purchase the appropriate climber manual for your bike. This is an incredible asset to your toolbox. If you own the bike, you should own the climber manual for it. This will give you torque specifications and procedures that, along with this video and reading this book, may help you understand the process a bit better and help you to do a better job in less amount of time than what the average person would take. So with that, let us begin. In this segment of the video, we are going to show you how to remove your transmission and replace your clutch. This example behind me has a stripped input shaft at 53,000 miles because the bike probably has never had a spline loop. It is of the utmost importance to make sure that you, every 40,000 miles, you remove your transmission, clean and lubricate the splines on the input shaft of the transmission and inside the clutch hub. You will just clean those, do not lubricate those. The only lubricant you put on is on the transmission splines. So let us begin. You can begin by removing the battery. You will need to remove the airbox lid, so take your air temperature sensor connector, push this in and lift up. You'll see it's dry. You should pack that with dielectric grease as well, both in there and on the back side, even though these are plugged. It's a little extra insurance. Earlier models, right through 99, had two silver clips. 2000, they went to Phillips screws. You need to back these out. You don't need to remove them. Just keep turning till they stop coming out. Now you can lift the lid up and pull it back. You'll see these little tangs in the front fit into the slots in the front of the airbox. You need to remove this bolt. You'll need a 5mm Allen that holds the front of the snorkel. Slides out. Then your snorkel can be lifted out of the airbox and removed from the motorcycle. Once your screws for the battery are removed, you pull this rubber strap down and away, flop it over on the side, and slide the battery out. Fortunately, BMW designed this model so that if you do need to change the battery, you can do it with the fairing and fuel tank and everything on. You do need to remove the left fairing panel, and then you can slide the battery out the left side. Still a pain in the ass compared to other bikes, but at least it's accessible without removing the fuel tank. Your next step is going to be removal of your air filter element. Look it over. Make sure it's clean in between the pleats without pushing this apart any further than this. You don't want to tear the paper at the bottom. If you do, you should replace the filter. So as we see, this one isn't horrible, so we will most likely reuse it. Inspect your airbox for leaves, dirt, etc. In a normal service, we would vacuum this. In this case, it is going to be removed, so we will clean it when it's off the bike. Bottom of your battery tray, you have two nuts that you will need a 10mm socket for. Chris has already removed them. Those nuts hold the mounts to the top of the transmission. The battery tray bolts to the top of the transmission. Your next step is going to be removal of the three airbox screws. You need a 4mm Allen wrench to do this. You have one located here inside the airbox. You have one located here. And another one on the left side in the same location as the right. Once the 3 airbox screws are removed, your next step is going to be loosening these clamps. The back of the throttle body, front of the airbox, right side and left side. Once those 2 clamps are loose, you twist the tube back and forth. Might be difficult. If it's really hard, you can add some rubbing alcohol to that area in the airbox grommet so that the tube will slide back easier, but generally you don't have to.
Might need to.
Yeah, this one's gonna be difficult. It's off enough anyway. Lots of little crevices in this engine design so that you'll often end up with stones and pebbles and nuts and all kinds of things trapped in little places that will fall out once you start taking this apart to remove the transmission. So there we have it. Tube slid back into the airbox. Our next step is going to be removal of the foot peg plates. We'll start with the right side. This foot peg plate is damaged already. You need to remove this. There is a nut on the back, so you need a 6mm Allen. And you need an 8 for this one. With your 6mm Allen, you are going to remove those 3 screws. Then you're going to remove these 2 here with your 5mm Allen. These 2 small screws hold the rear master cylinder to the foot peg plate. Holding the camera with one hand and working with the other often results in dropped tools, as I'm sure you've just heard. Trying to help speed this up, but it doesn't always work that way. You will also need to release the linkage for the rear brake. That is this here. You take this little spring clip and move it backwards as such, and then remove this and put it right back in place. You can also leave it attached if you want, and it will just come out of the rear brake reservoir. The reason I remove it from the pedal instead is it can be a little difficult your first few times to get this back into the rubber grommet and seated properly. So our last 2 screws on this side are going to be here. We need an 8mm for this one, and our 6mm Allen and a 13mm wrench for the back. Before you remove this foot peg plate, you'll see that the brake light switch wire is attached and zip tied to the frame. You need to follow this back up. This is the connector. It's not the connector for that. The connector for that is a green wire and a yellow wire, which is this. Again, take the foot peg plate off and go put it up with your other items. This is a good time to reinstall some of the hardware that you removed so you don't get confused during reassembly. You don't need to reinstall all of it. We're not going to bother putting them in the transmission because in this case we're changing the transmission. We're going to pop that out of the frame. Our next step is going to be removal of the rear caliper and the anti-lock brake sensor. Your ABS sensor, anti-lock brake sensor, is held in place with a Torx head screw. You will need a T20 driver or a T20 socket to remove it. Once you get the screw out, you can turn the sensor back and forth and work it out of the housing. Do not lose the shims. This one has a multitude of shims. Get that out. Now you need an 8mm Allen socket and our X socket, and you will remove the 2 caliper bolts. Collect all of your anti-lock brake sensor shims and use a bread tie, nice inexpensive item to keep around your shop. Tie them to the anti-lock brake sensor, that way you know where the shims are and how many were there. You may need to rock the caliper back and forth to spread the pads a little bit, and we're going to move that right out of the way. Our next step is going to be removal of the rear wheel. This is a simple task. You need a 17mm socket, some kind of hook to remove your hubcap. These just press in. They have one little protruding tab that fits into the recessed tab in the wheel. So I'll put the transmission in first gear. So if the wheel, well, actually in this case it's not going to matter because the splines are stripped, but normally you would put it in first gear. Use a deep 1/2" drive 17mm socket with a breaker bar. With the 4 lug bolts removed, you can move the wheel off the rear end. You have to work it past the bolt on the paralever pivot by going back and forth. Now move it towards me and out. You will have a shim on the wheel. Do not lose the shim. Failure to use the shim will move the rear wheel to the right of the motorcycle, which will make right-hand turns a little interesting. Next, you can remove the left foot peg. You can start with a bolt in the rear on the inside. This is why we removed the rear wheel already, instead of the foot peg plate first. Our next bolt that we remove will be this one, which mounts the muffler. You will need an 8mm to remove that bolt, as opposed to the 6mm just used to remove this one. The bolt that Chris is removing right now is directly opposite of this other bolt, which is also an 8, to remove the foot peg plate. Then you'll use your 6mm for the final 3 bolts. You'll say, hey, but there's 4 bolts in front of us. You're right, but you're only going to remove these 3. This one is the adjuster for your shift lever. By loosening this bolt enough to back it out to come out of the groove, you can drop this down, not by much, and raise this shifter's static height slightly. Good if you have big feet like me, but to be honest, it really doesn't make much of a difference to most people. I'd like to take a moment here and look at the exhaust. Your frame will have these mounts here, most likely with nothing in them. The early models had tabs on the catalytic converter and they had rubber mounts here. Those rubber mounts were very expensive. They were over $30 each when they were available. They are no longer available now. You don't need them. Even if your bike came with them, don't bother reusing them. They usually break during disassembly. They're of marginal quality for the price, and they don't do anything. They are not needed, and that's why BMW stopped using them as well. Although they never deleted the tabs on the frame. With our last bolt out of the left foot peg plate, we are now, the plate is only held on by the shift linkage. You'll look at the ball, you'll see this tiny little spring clip. Let's get a picture. Chris is going to release that, and then I will show you some details about this little clip. Lift the clip out of the way, then you can lever the ball right out of the socket and be gone. Here is the clip, infamously known as the Jesus clip. Why? Because when you lose it, you'll say, Jesus Christ, where the fuck did that go? I needed that. Jesus clips can be found on all kinds of different vehicles in various shapes. It's not unique to BMW. How does this little fucker go back in? Fits in like this. You'll watch carefully. It goes through the side of the inside of the ball socket and fits through another hole and protrudes back out here. Then the whole assembly swings around, clips into place. That is what holds the ball into the socket. We will also notice that we are missing the felts that go around the face of the sockets. We will be replacing those during reassembly. Our next step is going to be removal of the starter. You do not need to disconnect any of the wires. You do need to use a 6mm Allen socket, remove this bolt, and there's another bolt way under here. Those are the only two holding the starter in place. You may have difficulty removing the starter from the engine block because there is a dowel pin in this hole. If you want to squirt some penetrating oil into it before you start disassembling it, you can. I'm not a big fan of penetrating oil. I don't bother. You can tap this to get it free. During reassembly, I coat that pin with copper anti-seize or Starburg's paste. Either one is applicable in that situation. And that will ease disassembly the next time this comes apart. We'll pull the starter back a little bit. Oh, we're caught on the wires. We gotta cut that zip tie here. That zip tie secures the wires to your Sidestand safety switch and over to your oil pressure switch. Now we can move that out of the way. That can just hang. You'll notice this casing sheathing on the wire is falling apart. The wire itself is not damaged. No worries about that. It's normal to find little metallic particles in here in the starter gear. Again, nothing to worry about. So we can leave that hanging out of the way. Now we're going to move on to removing the exhaust. Returning to the right side of the motorcycle, we have one clamp holding this exhaust system on at the moment because our rear has already been removed. It would be this one here under the right cylinder. You need a 15mm socket. I would use a 1/2-inch drive to release that. Sometimes you'll need to heat it. It depends how rusty it is. If it doesn't turn freely, stop. Get out your MAP gas torch and heat that sucker up good Before we remove that though, we have some zip ties to cut. You'll see your oxygen sensor here, your O2 sensor. Follow the wire up and cut the zip ties that are holding it in place. Pay attention to the routing of this. On this model, it runs up through here in a bracket. On some of the earlier ones, it actually runs here around this little triangulated, or behind this little triangulated tab and over the cam chain rail bolt and up on the back of the cylinder head. But anyway, as we follow this along, we have another zip tie here to cut, working our way towards our connector, which is here. If you snip your zip ties close to the head, where the other end of the zip tie goes through the head, you can reuse these in a different location if you want to be cheap. I only mention that in case you don't have a supply of zip ties handy. It's a good habit to get into, especially if you ride off-road and such, to cut them this way so that they're reusable if you need them. Now you're going to twist this collar until it stops. As you twist it, it will pull the plug apart. Same when it goes back together, you screw it together, it brings the plug back in. Once that is free, run it behind the wires so you can get the plug out. We have a little bit of a tangled mess here. Pull our wire down between the throttle body and the transmission, and now we're loose. And now Chris can go after that exhaust clamp. You'll notice it's turning freely. He's not fighting with it. If he were fighting with it, we would stop and use the map gas. You don't have to remove the nut right now. You can, but you don't need to. What you do need to focus on is this little half moon piece. That needs to be broken free from the clamp, because right now this nut is doing nothing, but the clamp has not moved, changed position. So this needs a little tap on the back of this to break that free. So we try to get in and give this a good tap. There we go. Once this is free, this clamp will open up easier. Now you see we can move the clamp slightly side to side. This clamp is pinned. You see this hole in the top? There is a bump welded on the exhaust to fit into that hole. So this clamp will always remain in that position. So now we're going to remove the exhaust from the header. And again, if you have great difficulty in this, stop. You may have to heat this up with map gas quickly. But the best way to do this is to grab the end of the muffler and the cat, as Chris is doing, go up and down and side to side. And as we see, it is coming off. You got it. Again, we'll get that out of the way, put that over there with our saddlebags, and move on to the next step. With the exhaust removed, our next step is to remove the rear drive. Before we do that, we're going to drain it. Remove the fill plug first. You need a 6mm hex. By loosening the fill plug first, the rear drive will drain more efficiently. which doesn't really apply in this case because we already have the ABS sensor out, so it's going to vent quite freely. You want to inspect your drain plug when you remove it. You're looking for any metal. Oh, get it out of there. A little fuzziness is normal and perfectly acceptable. As we see, we're draining okay, but if we move the fill plug, it drains a little easier. So while that's draining, if you are fortunate enough to have these nice stainless steel clamps instead of the shitty zip ties, go ahead and unscrew this clamp. Notice the position that this clamp is in. That is the correct position. If this had both stainless steel clamps, they would both be positioned here at 3 o'clock with the screw head facing up. In this case, we have a zip tie on the rear and a nice screw clamp on the front. If this were to have both zip ties, you can just muscle the zip tie back with the boot and not have to cut the zip tie. Oh, as we see, we are puking all over the place. That means we have an output shaft seal. You'll notice that the fluid we drained from the rear drive was red, and the fluid that is draining out of this area is yellow. We will drain the transmission to confirm, but I pretty much guarantee you the transmission oil is going to be yellow. That indicates to us that the output shaft seal is leaking and oil is running down here through the swing arm, collecting in the back. That is not of major concern. Neither is a pinion seal leak here. While it is messy, it's not really an indicator that anything is terribly wrong besides just the seal is leaking. Quite often, once the pinion seal starts to leak within 20, 30, 40,000 kilometers, the ring gear seal on the back side of this rear drive will start to leak. When the ring gear seal starts to leak, that is a very good indication that the ring gear bearing cage is coming apart and the cage is tearing the seal, and that's why that is leaking. When that happens, you do need to cease riding the motorcycle, remove the rear drive, ship it to Bruno, have it rebuilt, or install a replacement rear drive. So right now we're going to drain the transmission just to verify that it does in fact have nice yellow oil in it. To drain the transmission, you need an 8mm hex to loosen your fill plug. Give it a good whack downwards with your fist. That's why I use the long ratchet. And now you need a 13mm socket with an extension to get into the drain plug. That's good. Hey, look at that. Transmission's red as well. So now we have a mystery. I'm actually glad this is here. It kind of brings up the question of what is leaking and is it still leaking? Now, some history on this particular bike. It's always good to know the history of the bike. Customer bought this motorcycle in Virginia or West Virginia, rode it home to Ohio, works fairly close to his home, rode it to work and home the first day, and then the second day the bike failed as he got home. The input shaft stripped. So this probably has about 600 miles on it at best since he purchased it from the dealer or the customer. I don't know if it was a private sale or not. So anyway, we can assume that the fluids were changed right before the sale and the bike was not used except for post-sale on its way back to Ohio and then the 2 commutes to work. So that may have not been enough time for whichever seal is leaking to have moved the new red oil into the swing arm cavity. So we really don't know what is leaking yet at this point. But as I said, it's not a big issue. So we will, at this point, proceed forward. Our next step is going to be removal of the nut for the torque arm for the paralever. This arm that runs underneath is actually a torque arm. As this suspension goes up and down, this rear drive pivots like this, linked by the torque arm. That gets rid of any torque jack effect you would get as you roll on and off the throttle with a conventional shaft drive motorcycle such as an old Airhead or a monolever equipped BMW. So you use a 16mm wrench and socket. We're going to leave the bolt in place. We're just going to remove the nut and its washer. And then we are going to move along to these pins. Two tools that I guess you could call specialty tools or semi-hard to obtain that you are going to need to do this part is a 12mm hex socket or a 12mm Allen wrench. You don't have to have a socket. The socket just makes this a little easier. And you need a 30mm 30mm shallow socket for the other side. These pins were unfortunately installed with thread locker at the factory. We were told at BMW school in 1999 to not put thread locker on them again. These pins are to be, when they're removed, they're to be cleaned, get rid of all the thread locker that you can, and reinstall them dry. They do not use thread locker, something the factory did for whatever reason. Perhaps they thought their techs weren't going to torque them properly during assembly. Nonetheless, these have Loctite on them, thread locker. So, if you're not sure if this has been a part before, you didn't do it, whatever, get out your map gas. Helps if you turn it on. And heat the pin, not the area around it. Heat the pin. Your goal is to reach 260 degrees. If you have an infrared heat gun, you can check that and see if you have reached the temperature or not. I also suggest an extension for your breaker bar. As you'll see, I not only have the front end clamped into the vise on my lift, I also have straps securing the front of the bike to the lift. So, at this point, Chris is going to go ahead and see if we can get that pin to move. Broke free. If this turns nicely, let's get one, maybe two complete turns out of it and stop. Now we're going to move to the other side. Same here. We're going to heat the pin, not the area around the pin. The reason you're heating this pin is so that the pin gets hot and will melt the thread locker. Thread locker is a liquid. Once exposed to air, it turns into solid plastic. So you want to heat this to melt that. Now we're going to use our 30mm socket, and we're going to break this free as well. Make sure you're seated all the way on. That turns nicely. Now we're going to grab our 12mm hex socket, get right in the center, and we're going to completely remove that pin. Get that off. we've removed our adjustment pin from the left side. Now we're going to take the blind pin from the right side. If you find that that becomes too stiff to turn, stop and reheat it. You want to have someone hold the bottom of the rear drive, because once that pin is out, this rear drive will pivot backwards and fall down on the lift. While it's improbable that you're going to have any damage to the disc if that happens, it makes no sense causing any undue stress or impact on anything. Now you can push this bolt through and Chris will take it away. Good place to put those is in your bench vise. If you have soft jaws, all the better, whether they be rubber or aluminum. Clamp the disc in there, up a little bit. We want just the disc, not the carrier. Down a little, perfect. And that's it. And there's a nice home for your rear drive that can hang out waiting for you to inspect it. We see we still have some lube on the splines. Nice and clean down here. Our bearing races for our power lever pivot bearings. And the other bearing race is stuck to the pin. Not an issue. Next, we do the same thing with the swing arm. We're going to heat this pin. Chris is going to get ready with the 12mm hex and the breaker bar and our fork tube for leverage. With our pin heated, it turns nicely. Excellent. Same deal as the rear drive. Go 1-2 complete turns and stop and move over to the other side. Someone has run these wires around here. They don't go there. I don't know why someone would do that. You can tell by the zip ties, these skinny little things, that they're not factory zip ties and the wiring doesn't go there. This is the other port for the accessory outlet that fits here. And I really don't care that these wires are run here, but right now I don't want them to burn while we're heating up our pin. So here we go. Same thing, 30mm socket. We're going to loosen the nut, and then we're going to use our 12mm hex to remove the pin completely. While I'm heating this up, Chris is going to loosen up the rear shock bolt. You'll need a 15mm wrench for the nut, which is on the right side of the shock, and a 14mm socket or wrench for the head of the bolt, which is on the left side. The bolt will only fit one way due to the shape of the swing arm. So with that removed, and with this pin hot, we can now hit that with a 30mm socket and then the 12mm hex to take the pin completely out, and then we'll move to the right side and completely remove that pin as well. With both the pins removed, we can now remove the swing arm. You're going to have to give it a little bit of a yank backwards initially to break the seal. You are also going to have to push your torque arm down and come down at an angle. And that is it. Our swing arm is out. Our drive shaft is the next thing to be removed. To remove the drive shaft, you're going to need to use a long punch or something with leverage. And since we're going through this hole that is threaded, we don't want to damage the threads. So I use a piece of leather, make a little tube out of it. You can insert that through. We have to find the proper spot on the shaft. What we are looking for is to get the tip of the punch against the drive shaft yoke. I'll show you from the other side. I don't have a clear view of the other side, so what you're after is getting the punch into this region. Can I see the punch for a second? So you're looking at this type of arrangement, so that when you whack the punch forward, it's going to lever the drive shaft off the output shaft. Yeah, and that's it. That's all it takes, and our drive shaft is removed. On this bike, since we are replacing the transmission, we're now going to take the torque arm off of the transmission, but normally we wouldn't do that if this transmission were going back into this vehicle. You look in the back of the transmission, you're going to see this bundle of switches. This one has two stacked on top of each other. The bottom one is your, the bottom one is your gear indicator. This top one is your neutral switch. For bikes without a rider information display, you won't have the bottom one, you'll only have this top one. Above that is your clutch arm, which your clutch cable attaches to. You don't really have to do much with these, except before you pull a transmission, you need to follow your wires back, up along here, snip any zip ties that are in the way. So you need to access the connectors, one of which is here. The other is buried right here. You must remove both of these. This one, squeeze, pull. This one, push down here. I'm sorry, push down here and remove. Now you can pull these down, get them out of the way. I disconnected one that I didn't really have to, and which was this one. That's the Sidestand safety switch. What we're after was this one. Both browns, both grounds. Again, just squeeze them. So now that is out of the way. This is out of the way. Our switches are disconnected from the frame of the motorcycle. Looking above the right and left cylinder heads, you're going to see that your subframe runs along here and is secured here. You'll need an 8mm hex to remove that bolt. Just above that is what all of this assembly pivots on. You'll need a 17mm socket. Just loosen that. You do not need to remove the nut. So give it a good 360-degree turn. The other side might be turning too. Not that much of an issue. Now we're going after that Allen bolt in the front. We're going to remove that completely. We are going to remove this one here on the transmission, and then we will move over to the right side of the motorcycle again. You will find on the R1100RT that the bolt in the front and the one at the transmission are both the same length, so no worries about mixing them up. I believe they're the same on the right side as well. Go ahead, Chris is going to remove that one. And the other one is not on the side like the left side. The other one is in the back here. The two bolts on the right side are also the same length and identical to what was on the left. So no worries of confusing those or getting them mixed up. The next thing you need to do is to feed a soft tie, something short, through the frame. You don't want to grab or be over any cables, brake hoses, or anything like that. So make sure your soft tie or strap is under everything. Next, we're going to use a motorcycle tie-down strap and attach from there to the rear of the bike. With our strap secured in the front and in the rear, we can now begin the process of lifting the frame. Stop. So you're going to go slowly and lift the rear frame as you tighten the strap. We're going to stop in various spots to look at a few things here. You want to make sure that all your zip ties that need to be cut are cut, and that nothing is being pulled, pinched, or crushed. Okay, alright, stop there. Now that we're up a bit, I can point out some things that need to be done. The fuel lines run through the airbox, so you want to remove your electrical connector for the injector, and then you're going to take this clip off of the fuel injector, and you're going to pull this line back. Put your clip back on here so you don't lose it. It goes in the top notch. You'll do the same thing on the other side. And you'll notice this zip tie right here, this harness is zip tied to the airbox. You don't need to redo that when you put this back together. Hey, look at that. We found one of the little plastic washers that we're missing. So we're going to cut this zip tie, which will free the harness from the airbox. That will free that harness up and allow us to raise this up some more. Other items we want to look at are here. This will usually be okay. Make sure none of our wires are hanging up. We can disconnect this right here. Squeeze this tab and separate it. Oh, I can't do this with one hand. Maybe I can. I cannot. Holy crap, come apart, would you? Wow, there's no way that was coming apart. One hand. That runs in front of the airbox behind the frame, so we're going to pull that out and leave that hang. We'll come up some more. Stop right there. One item we forgot to remove was this screw, which holds the rear brake lines on. Pull the master cylinder reservoir out. There, now those are free. Now we can go up. At this point, we are going to disconnect our vent hose from the airbox. This does require a special tool to reinstall it, or you can replace it with a regular screw type hose clamp. If you'd like to go through the expense and purchase this tool, it works nicely to install and remove this clamp. You squeeze it, give it a turn, and that is released. Now we can pull our airbox back. We are going to remove our clutch cable. by pushing the arm forward and pulling the ball out of the end. And the reason we need to do that is because our brake line runs behind the clutch cable and has become in the way of what we need to do here. Alright, so now our airbox is free. Your fuel lines run between these two metal lines. Try not to bend the lines too much. You can tweak them a bit to get them out of the way. They're fairly pliable, but you don't want to overdo it. So we push our rear caliper up to there. We're going to go up some more, tighten our strap, and that should be all we need to get this transmission out. You will now need a 6mm hex socket, an extension, and a ratchet. You are going to remove the middle left bolt. We have our 2 alignment dowels. This makes removal and reinstallation of the transmission a bit easier. Do you need them? No. Are they anything special? Well, they're overpriced from BMW. They're about $50 for the pair, as I recall. It's been many years since I bought them. You can make them out of long bolts. Just cut the heads off, put a slot in the end, you're all set. So put the short one in, screw it in 4 or 5 full turns. It does not have to be tight, obviously. The next one we're going to remove is the bottom right. And while Chris is doing that, I'll point out you have this metal bracket. Remember, that's where the oxygen sensor for the exhaust was zip tied to. The metal bracket runs across from that one to here and then has a 90-degree bend to it. The bolt above that has this funky little tab that holds the vacuum hose that goes to the throttle body. The bolt on the top has nothing. The top on the left has nothing. Middle on the left has this U-shaped tab on it, and the bottom, of course, goes through the metal bracket that we started with here. So now that this is out, we're going to screw. Go ahead and take the other one out. Get that bracket right out of the way. Screw this in. That's good. And now we will remove the other 3 bolts, the 2 on the top, 1 on the side, and then we can pull the transmission. Here is where we solve our mystery about that oil leak. You'll notice it is dry here. No fluid at all. It is not the output shaft seal. That means the leak is at the the leak is at the pinion seal on the rear drive. All 6 of our Bellhousing bolts are out. Our 2 guide pins are in. Our gear indicator and neutral switch have been disconnected. The clutch cable is disconnected. And obviously the clamp that holds the 2 metal brake lines for the rear has been removed from the transmission. We now grab the transmission. On one of the dowels. Right now we're caught on the cable. Once you get the transmission moved back just a little bit, you're going to run into this mount hitting these 2 cables. You're going to have someone lift that up so that you can get the threaded portion under the cables. not a big deal. I just want to point that out. That's one thing that's going to hinder the removal of this transmission. The easiest way to do that is use a long pry bar. Get on top of the engine case, not the transmission case, and just lift up. This transmission is being a bit difficult. Alright, you can see now we're clear. That's not what's holding us. There you go. If you look at the dowel pins here, you'll see how rusty they are. That is one of the problems that can be avoided by using copper anti-seize or even Stauberog's paste like we're going to use on the splines. You put it here, you put it all around this dowel pin, and then the little tiny pin for the starter. To do that makes life much easier the next time this has to come apart. As we see here, our clutch hub is stripped right out. We'll get some pictures. Say, look man, no teeth. This is what happens when you fail to perform a spline lube. This is unfortunate. We'll get some pictures of these splines, but I'm sure even on video you can see how distorted they are. That is from lack of lubrication. I mentioned earlier this bike had 53,000. I was mistaken. It is 57,000, almost 58,000. And I'm sure this transmission has not been removed prior to this. To replace the clutch, you have 6 clutch cover bolts to remove. You can buy the special tool that wedges in here against the starter teeth to hold it in place. You can use a pry bar and very gently hold some tension between the starter ring gear and the bell housing of the engine. These are torqued to 18 or 20 Newton meters. These bolts you do replace. If you're in Siberia and you've had to put a clutch in and you don't have new bolts, reuse them. You won't have any problems. It's not a high enough torque where the bolt's going to break using them 2 or 3 times. Replace them if you can. If you can't, don't sweat it. So once these 6 bolts are off, we're going to lever this whole clutch pack off. Okay, Chris has all of the bolts out. This came out nicely. Notice the order they are in. Next in line is your spring dish facing the bold portion facing the engine, obviously, so your clutch rod pushes here to release the pressure that holds these 2 halves together. When you pull the clutch lever in and the rod pushes on the spring, these 2 pieces separate, allowing your friction disc to rotate freely in between. Very simple design. If you'd like to, you can use white out in a bottle with the little dauber, the little brush on the end, and run a paint mark onto the flywheel teeth and then across this whole clutch pack. Way back when, these clutch assemblies used to be balanced. I have found over the last couple of years that when you buy new parts, there's no paint marks anymore. It used to be that you would take the factory paint marks, put them at 120 degrees apart from each other, flywheel, front clutch cover, rear clutch cover, 120 degrees apart, and that would balance them. As I said though, the last couple of years there's been no marks on them, so they are either not balancing them, I don't know. It's not really an issue on the oil head anyway, so that's why I did not mark this one, but I want to mention it in case you see other videos of mine where I show that you do have to do that, especially the airheads and the K-bikes, the older K-bikes, K75, K100, K1100. But not so important on this. But you can do it if you want, so everything goes back together in the same order. Of course, that won't matter if you're changing these parts. This is the important part. I use Stubby's NBU 30 PTM. That is what the factory used. This is how much you need to do a spline lube. That is all. Just a little bit. Same if you're going to use Honda Moly, you might even want to use a little less. All you want to do is just coat these splines. Make sure you get deep into each valley. Work it in good, back and forth. And that's it. You do not do the clutch disc. Leave the fucking clutch disc alone. If you put it on the clutch disc, what ends up happening, well, there isn't too much on that one. It ends up slinging out the back. You don't want to run the chance of getting this shit on the friction disc. So before we put our Stubby's away, we had difficulty with this pin because it's this dowel because it's rusty. Give that a little scrub. And if Chris pulls that starter back, I'll hit that little pin there, which gave us a little bit of grief. And then we're going to hit the other one up here as well. And that's it. That is all you need. Some pictures. One more place you can use the Stubby's. Take your clutch rod. You'll see this edge right here. This is what runs against the spring plate. Right there. If you do like most motorcyclists and you sit at a stop in first gear, the engine running with the clutch pulled in, you are pressing against this. So it's good to have some Stubby's right here on this edge. Not a lot. We're not going nutty. Just give it a little coat. As such, wipe off the excess. You just want it on the face, on that little beveled portion here. And that's it. We're done with that. Now we're going to assemble the clutch pack. We have our new clutch bolts already ready to go with new washers on them. We have our clutch pack all assembled. We have our alignment tool in place, so we're going to put the spring in. Make sure the spring sits in where it should be. Make sure your clutch pack is lined up. You want your alignment tool to spin freely throughout the process of installing these bolts and torquing them. You may have to press on this clutch pack to get the bolts started. That is because of the clutch spring. But so far these are going along just fine. It's popular tonight.
You know, no girly girls. Facebook works wonders.
And now we'll get the torque wrench. Just torque down.
22 root.
Set your torque wrench to 18 Newton meters. Again, you want to make sure your alignment tool spins freely throughout this process. Good. Mark it. I mark them green. Means it's torque. Do these in a star pattern.
Well, hello.
Hey, you're gonna have some comedy in this
right?
fucking video. See, it still spins freely. We are done, and we are now ready to reinstall our transmission. Before we reinstall this transmission, I'd like to point something out. On your clutch rod, you have this little felt. Some people are mistaken in believing that this is an oil control device. It is not. As you see, the transmission shaft is hollow. That is where this rod goes. There is no oil getting through either end of this. This felt is here so that this clutch rod doesn't rattle around inside this shaft and make all kinds of noise. It has nothing to do with oil control. So even if you left this felt out, the worst you're going to have is a little bit of a noisy clutch rod at idle. Not a big deal. So now we're going to move along and get this transmission installed. And speaking of clutch rods, don't forget to put it in the transmission. Now is the time. Up we go. You want to get your middle left guide pin and the lower right guide pin lined up. Slide this forward. You'll remember our little battery tray mount up top with the wires that go around the back of it. Now's the time to lift those up out of the way and push this transmission forward a little bit. If you're having trouble getting the splines to line up, reinstall the shaft in the back and turn the shaft a little bit, and everything will go in nicely. Make sure you have no hoses jammed between the transmission and the engine. Make sure there's no wiring jammed in between them. You're going to have some spring tension here because we still have our clutch arm installed and the clutch rod's in, so it's going to push against your spring plate. We can fix that by gently starting a couple of bolts, and then we'll push it the rest of the way manually because it's might take a little effort to get over the dowel pins. The best way to do this, drawing the transmission to the engine, is by using nothing more than a T-handle and a couple of bolts. 4 if you need to. You just want to draw it in gently. You're not whaling this thing into place. And that's good. Now we're going to give it a tap here in the back with a rubber mallet and make sure it slides in where it should. Once you're comfortable with the fact that the transmission will mate up against the engine okay, you can remove all of your guide pins, install the rest of your bolts, and then these get torqued to 20 Newton meters. All 6 Bellhousing bolts will be torqued to 20 Newton meters. You will need your 6mm hex. Of course, remember where your bolts go. The middle left and the middle right have unique brackets attached to them. The little loopy one goes on the left side. This little angular one goes on the right. Don't forget you have the metal bracket that the oxygen sensor zip ties to. Goes across the bottom, and the 2 top bolts are bare. Pay attention to what type of drain plug you have in your transmission. You'll see these have different heads. One is considerably more pronounced than the other. The one with the longer head has a flat face to it where it goes into the transmission, as opposed to the other one that is tapered. Believe it or not, this flat one does not get a crush seal. The other one with the taper does get a crush seal. It is the same size crush seal that your fill plug and drain plug on the rear drive use. The last 3 numbers from BMW are 200. They're a 14 by 18 crush washer. You can also use a 14 by 20 crush washer. I use the 14 by 20 crush seal. It's a little bit thicker than what BMW uses. Zip that in. You're going to torque that to 20 Newton meters. We are going to fill our transmission with 75 140 GL5 synthetic gear lube. This transmission calls for 800 cc. So 400 and 400. Drain plug torque to 20 Newton meters. Add your first 400 cc's of oil. Add your next 400 or as much of it as you can get in right now. Come on, chug-a-lug. Once this makes it into the transmission, we will torque the fill plug to 20 Newton meters also. And we'll dump the rest of this bottle into here, because we will need 230 cc's for the rear drive. So we'll put this off to the side for now because we're not ready to put the rear drive on yet. There is really no need to replace the crush seals on your fill plugs unless they are super thin and leaking. They're not submerged in oil, so you really don't need to change those every time like you do with the drains. Now we're ready to reinstall the airbox. Remember what I said about the fuel lines. They always go between the two metal brake lines. Our clutch cable rides here, but we're not worried about that right now. So let's take the clutch cable out of the equation. We're good there. Now we have this clamp. As I said, if you have the tool to crimp these, you can reuse this. If you don't, and you don't want to buy the tool, then I suggest you just get the proper size clamp for this vent hose. So right now, we're going to lift the airbox up. I'm going to put that hose back on, and then I'll crimp it. But I can't do that with one hand. So this is your crankcase breather hose. This is very important. If this hose gets crimped, you will likely blow out your oil sight window or your rear main seal, or perhaps both. You also want this to remain hooked up to the airbox because the airbox provides the extra vacuum that the crankcase needs to breathe. So you get this airbox pushed up into the hose, you get your clamp lined up, use your special tool in the right direction. Yeah, I'll get too close, that's just going to get blurry. Gently squeeze and click, and you're there. And that's all you need to do with that. Now we will move along and we can start putting this frame down, paying extra close attention to the stuff on the right side. So you need to get the brake lines configured and everything else. So Chris is going to go on the left side of the bike and start releasing that strap. One thing you have to be very careful about is the back of the airbox. When it comes time to go into the frame, go ahead and release that. Do it in little steps. Yeah. Okay, stop there. I want this out of the way so that doesn't get trapped up there. And let's watch our brake lines are here. Okay, down some more. Keep going. Stop. Okay, our brake lines are free. Those are doing okay. Our clutch cable goes under the fuel lines. So we want to start lining that up here. Cable fitted into that pocket. We'll hook it up on the end in a moment. Oh, premature there. Hit the clutch cable back out. It does go over the metal brake line. My mistake. It's late at night. It's been a long day. Get that cable right out of the way. Okay. Let's continue down. You want to make sure the airbox is pressed forward when you get to this point, because it's very easy to break the back of the airbox when this comes down on top of it. Let's go ahead. More. Stop. I'm going to take this hose right out of here. So as I said, we're going to get rid of the charcoal canister and make some changes to that. Now you see where this is hitting on the airbox. So, up a little bit. Just move the airbox forward, Chris. Push the whole thing forward. Okay, now that's in place there. Go ahead down. More. More. And stop. Right now, we have the metal tab of the frame riding on top of the airbox. So I'm going to lift this up. Chris is going to pull the airbox towards him. And we're not going for some reason here. Okay, there we go. Moving over to the left side. Again, we're looking at that little tab that the airbox mounts to. We see that it's resting on top of this harness. So Chris is going to lift the back of the subframe up a little bit. This harness needs to be shoved in further to clear all of that. Go ahead down. Hold on. You might have to do some pushing around of this big bundle of wires, that harness and the group coming down. Fuel line goes behind that bundle of wires. And you need access to, you need to be able to have a clear shot to the airbox screws. So you got a little poking and prodding to do to move stuff around to get it lined up properly. Our frame is down, things are in position, our brake lines are routed properly. Now you can clamp them together. Put some copper anti-seize on the screw, even though it has blue Loctite on it. I suggest you use the copper anti-seize. So the next time you need to remove this when you do your spline lube, it comes off without snapping off. So I can't do this with two hands, so you can figure out bottom line fits into this clip, and then put it together and tighten it down. Pay attention to the brake line routing. If you need to bend it and tweak it here and there, you can do that. Just don't fold it in half. Don't crush the line. Now we're going to move on to our clutch cable. As remember, we moved this up out of the way. We're going to bring that back. It's going to go behind the throttle cable, which, by the way, I'll point out, when we had this lifted up, this was here. It's the most common problem when people dislodge their fuel tank, remove their fuel tank to change a battery on like an RS model or an R1100R or 850R, whatever, GS. They take the tank off and this cable gets dislodged, then they start the bike up and it runs like a bag of shit. You have to always make sure that these are seated back in their pockets. Back to our clutch cable. We are here on the outside of our metal brake lines. This is a challenging job with one freaking hand. Get that in here. It seats in its little pocket there. And we will push the arm forward and get the ball hooked up. Another thing I'll mention now that I have to laugh about, in the service checklist it mentions greasing the clutch cable ends. They do not mean wheel bearing grease, steering head bearing grease, or any heavy grease. It only means to lubricate it. It's a poor translation. You don't want to put a blob of freaking heavy grease on the end of that, it's just going to pack up with dirt and make a mess. Just spray it. Penetrating oil. I use Worth HHSK. It's kind of a thick paste, very much like chain lube. You can use chain lube if you'd like. Certainly more affordable than the Worth product. This is all this takes. It's just a little squirt of lube. That's all. And we will also do the same up top. And here. We will depress the lever, spray some in there, and we want a little bit up here on top of the ball. And that's it. Now, as you see, we have no free play because we have a new clutch and everything. And we also, this adjustment is wrong. This adjustment was wrong when the bike got here. This adjustment should be 12 millimeters between the knurled rings, and it does not need to ever be changed again. All of your adjustment for these is done at the back of the transmission on this arm. I'm going to adjust this now while everything is accessible and the swing arm is out. At the back of the transmission, we loosen the lock nut and back the center bolt out. That allows us some free play here. We're going to peel this rubber boot back. We're going to spin this out. We're going to use our Vernier calipers or whatever device you have that you can use that you're comfortable to make sure that this is a 12 millimeter gap between these rings. Grab those snap-on pliers in the drawer. Right there. That's the money. Now, to make this safer, I'm going to lock this into place with pliers. You don't need to reef on it. We don't need to turn. We're just going to turn it until it locks. Chris is going to grab the alcohol. Oh, I'm going to grab the alcohol. We're going to put a little bit on that boot so that boot nicely slides right back there into place. That is done. Now, our free play. You measure the free play by the opening. Squeeze this with your thumb and let out till it stops having resistance. See that opening here? That should be 7 millimeters. There we go. That's perfect. If we had, well, now we're going to go down and tighten the back. Here, there is a special tool for this. Looks like this. It's expensive and you don't need it. Makes life a little bit easier, but I want to show you something. If Chris goes back over by that clutch lever. If you pull the once you're adjusted to where we want to be, like we are now, go ahead and pull the clutch lever in. You can even tie it into place. Now all you need to do is lock the lock nut. The center bolt will not turn because it is under pressure. So you could do this with a stubby little wrench, but it is easier with this tool. Part number for this tool, 213610 from BMW, if you so desire. So our clutch adjustment is done. Now we can double check and make sure we have free play. As the clutch wears, the free play goes away. If you run out of free play, you must adjust the clutch immediately or you're going to burn up the friction disc. You won't even know it until it's too late and you're into the rivets and the clutch is just slipping. So make sure you have free play. Some copper anti-seize on these bolts, please. That way the next person who has to get into this bike to do a spline lube, clutch replacement, or any such thing can remove these bolts without any. So at this point you should have your airbox screws in. Remember, there's one here, one on each side, here, one on the right side. Remember your gear and neutral switches. Feed those through here like such. Pull them up. They are going to get plugged in up top here. We have our bolts into the frame, 4 bolts. These all get torqued to 47 Newton meters on the R1100RT. .47 Newton meters also applies to the nut on each side. Put a wrench on one side and tighten the other side with a torque wrench. Remember your battery tray, 2 washers, 2 nuts. Our frame is all bolted down and torqued. We are now going to move on to our fuel lines where they connect to the fuel injectors. Alcohol is very convenient here. Squirt some in there. Push that on. Take your clip, put it into place, rotate it so it can't back out. Plug that in. This side's done. Do the same on the other side. Next thing we're going to do is move these air tubes in. We're also going to put alcohol on this O-ring. You can replace it. If you find that it's too big and floppy, throw it in the freezer for a little while and it'll reduce the size. These air tubes really only go one way. See this line? This goes on the outside, horizontal. It is sometimes easier to squirt some alcohol up in here and push the tube back in. I didn't say this was easy, just that that would make it a little easier. Right now I'm bound up in there. And you want to make sure that this O-ring doesn't get pushed out of place. There also isn't a lot of room to get your fingers behind the tube because of the brake lines. So we're good there. That can be tightened down. And we'll do the same on the other side. You have now reached the point where you can remove the strap since your frame is bolted into place. Our next step is installation of the swing arm. We are going to add a little bit of assembly lube to the face of this accordion boot. This is not really to lubricate anything. This is merely to keep the water out. So you can use the grease of your choice or whatever you'd like, I guess. I wouldn't suggest gasket maker, silicone sealer, caulking, or anything like that, because this really isn't an issue of getting water in these anyway. They have a pretty good seal on their own. Okay, so now you're going to grab the swing arm, You're going to turn it so that the leg to the left is pointing straight down. You got to clear the shock. Connectors out of the way. Once you get it fitted into position, get that shock off of there. You're going to get it lined up and give it a shove forward. Now this should be springy. It should not fall off on its own, but it should be springy. That's the accordion boot. That means the front is seated where it should be, and it's just springing back and forth a little bit. So now you're going to put your pins in, and this is how you do that. You want to start with the non-adjustable pin first. You need to make sure the swing arm bearing is in the center of the hole, which I can't do with one hand here.
Up or down?
Right there. Always, 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 I cannot emphasize this enough, always thread these in by hand. Do not use a ratchet. And don't frickin' even consider getting your air tools out for this. An air impact will destroy this pin and most likely the threads in the transmission case as well. And there's no reason to have air for these anyway. So you thread that in as far as you can, which is almost all the way. We don't need to torque this just yet. Now we're going to go to the other side and put our adjustable pin in. I have coated this pin with assembly lube. As I mentioned earlier, you do not want to put any Loctite on these, even though the factory did. It's not to be done again. Now, before we get this pin in all the way, we are going to go to the other side and torque the non-adjustable pin to 150 Newton meters. 150 Newton meters is 110 pound-feet. Just so you have an idea of how much it moves after this is screwed in and came to a stop, I'm going to mark put a green paint mark on the pin. Chris is going to go ahead and torque it. So there you go. Not much here to here. So if you don't have a torque wrench, you can kind of get an idea how far that's going to go. Not very far. It's all set.
Oh.
This side is a little more complex. You want to make sure that the lock nut is backed off far enough on the pin not to touch the transmission case. You want to torque that pin to 10 Newton meters. Probably pretty close. Yeah, there you go. It's just going to give a little bit. Now our nut's not quite touching. Now for the challenging part. In order to tighten this lock nut to 105 Newton meters, you have to be able to keep the pin from turning. So what BMW offers is this socket that is cut out to allow enough room to get an Allen key in here. Make sure your socket's bottomed out. Go ahead. I'm going to do this in steps. One more, spin your socket around. Yep. Go ahead. Okay. Nope, I'm hitting the socket. There you go. And that's it. From here, you can put the bolt in to the lower shock mount. Once Chris has that done, he is going to torque that to 45 Newton meters. And then we will install the rear drive. So now we're on to the rear drive. These splines don't wear. You want to make sure the U-joint feels good. If it's got a little notch in it, that's kind of normal. They're not really put together all that great anyway. The end caps for the U-joint tend to be staked a little too tight sometimes. We are using Bellray assembly lube. I do not find it worthwhile to use Stubby in this application. Stubby is very expensive. If you want to use Honda Moly here, you can do that. I use this Bellray assembly lube instead. You're going to coat the splines. We're going to pluck the race out of the bearings. We're going to coat the bearings with the assembly lube as well on both sides. And then we're going to reinstall this. I'd like to pause for a minute and explain something about drive shaft phasing. Phasing means that you want your U-joints aligned properly. You notice this part is attached to the shaft. That needs to match this end. So this would be a correct assembly. This would be an incorrect assembly. Now this is completely opposite of this end, being the protruding part that would go in the output shaft. This end should be the same. It's not. So this needs to go as such. So in order to do that, you can mark your shaft ahead of time to give yourself some orientation, or you can look up in the tube now. What we see up there is this portion of the yoke. So that means our ears on the shaft are at 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock, hence our green marks on here. That's going to be important for this because we want this part of the shaft side to side on the rear drive. So I just wanted to point that out. If you get it out of line, it's usually not a big deal. It might make more of a difference on a GS with longer suspension travel than it would on an RT, an R, or an RS. Another thing I'd like to point out is this tube is affixed to this part. It's bonded together with rubber. High RPM clutch dropping launches, drag race starts such as that can wear this rubber to a point where this tube will actually slip on the rubber. So if you take one of these apart and you say, hey, who the fuck was in here? It's not phased properly. It might have been, and this tube has slipped on the rubber and now it's out of phase. So something to consider if you're hard on your bike and you suddenly develop a weird vibration. Take the rear drive off and see if your drive shaft is still phased. If it's out of phase, you should be looking at replacing the U-joint I'm sorry, you should be looking at replacing the drive shaft or shipping up to Bruno and have him rebuild it. And that's it. We will now move on to installing this rear drive, and we're going to try to get this buttoned up very soon. I'll give you this little tip. You'll notice that the drive shaft tail is right on the bottom of the swing arm housing. That's going to make it very difficult to get the stub shaft that's attached to the paralever rear drive started inside that tail of the shaft. So what you can do is take one of these shop towels, fold it up, roll it up, stick it underneath the tail end of the shaft. You want to put the shaft in the middle of the swing arm. Put 2 of your lug bolts from your wheel into the rear drive. This will allow you to turn and get things to fit properly, and you want to keep this yoke at 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock. So go ahead, Chris. We also need to put, hold on, we're missing a bushing, the inner bearing race. Gotta have the bearing race. Left that out from when I greased this. Okay, so now our tail of the front drive shaft is in the middle. You're gonna try to maneuver this into place. Hold on. You need to turn the rear drive to there, and there you go, you're in. Now we need the pins. The adjustable pin goes on the left side. This pin goes on the right. When you do this, you want to make sure that bearing is in the middle of the hole. Hold that right there. More right there. Just like with the front, screw this in by hand, please. I would hate to see you have to buy a new drive shaft and the pin. These pins are like $50. That drive shaft is over $300. That's a terrible waste of money just for a strip thread due to negligence. Too bad I'm missing the adapter. So we're going to screw this in by hand till it bottoms. We're not going to torque this. And I'm feeling a little resistance, so you're going to move the rear drive up and down. This should turn easily. That's better. You don't want to catch the edge of the bearing, because you will destroy that bearing. I don't like that. This would also be easier with the damn torque arm on, which we will do next. This was a good example. Screwing the pin in, I didn't like the way it felt, and it bound up at one point, so we took it apart, and 2 of the rollers had become dislodged from this. These are actually a fairly durable bearing, and they last a long time if you torque the pins properly. The manual lists a torque value that is too low. Anyway, we're able to put the 2 dislodged rollers right back in. There's no damage to the cage, and we are ready to put our bearing race back in, and we will reinstall this rear drive again from a little different camera perspective. Alright, here we go again. We want to make sure our shaft is at 9 and 3, just like that. Get that lined up. Get that up that way. There you go. Get the clamp out of here. Alright, I get this. You get the torque arm. Again, screw this in by hand. You need the torque arm, it's up on the shelf. Long silver bar. No, up, 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 to your left, up. Yeah, that's going in much nicer. Good. As you're doing that, keeping the rear drive pushed up and to the right of the motorcycle against the pin. Remember, normally we wouldn't have removed this, but in this example, we replaced the transmission, so that's why the torque arm was off. Through, that'll hold that in place. Now we're going to do the pin on the other side. Okay, a little assembly lube on the bearing area of this pin, and being the adjustable pin, we're going to coat the threads as well. You'll thank me when you go to take this apart next time. You want to line it up so that the bearing races in the middle. Again, by hand, this should crank in easily. We're going to stop there. We're going to torque the fixed pin on the other side to 150 Newton meters, which is 110 pound-feet. Then we will return to this side. Remember our shop rag we stuffed in there? We should have taken that out before we get the pins in, but we can still get to it. Much easier to remove this without the pins secured. So that's it. Push your boot back over. If you have the plastic zip tie, you can push the zip tie and the boot on at the same time. If you have the nice stainless steel band clamp, you don't have to. You'll slide that on after the boot's in place. Our next step is going to be torquing the pin on the other side, followed by torquing the nut on the bolt for the torque arm. Then we will be filling the rear drive with fluid and putting the rear wheel on. I take that back. We'll fill the rear drive with fluid, then we're going to put the exhaust on. You'll tighten your center pin to 10 Newton meters. That's it. Same as before, we need the special socket. We need our Allen wrench. Stop. It's weird, the socket really isn't cut open enough. Okay. Reset. Reset. Yes, this is a bit of a nuisance. However, if you set this right, your paralever bearings will last for tens of thousands of miles. Try one more. That's it. Alright, hit that bottom one at 40. You gotta do the front one at 40 as well. And then we're going to install the exhaust. Why do we do the exhaust before the wheel? Same reason we removed the wheel before the exhaust. We have this bolt here which mounts the exhaust, which is kind of a pain in the ass to get to if the tire is in the way. We're getting close to finishing this. Next, we put a new crush washer on our drain plug for the rear drive. Get rid of the old one. Screw in the plug. This gets torqued to 20 Newton meters. We have our funnel ready. We have 230 cc's of synthetic gear oil. There are times when you'll have to turn the rear wheel or the rear drive in reverse in order to purge the air out of the rear drive so that it will accept the rest of the oil. That's rare, but it does happen sometimes. In this case, we are okay. We have our fill plug around somewhere. You should be able to see the oil. Should be right at the bottom of the threads here. The fill plug also gets torqued to 20 Newton meters. You will need a 6mm hex for that. As I mentioned earlier, there is no need to change the crush washer, crush seal on the fill plugs on these bikes unless they are super thin from repeated torquing. Before we install the exhaust, get your copper anti-seize. It's the end of this bottle. Give it a good coat all the way around. This will help it to slide back on easier. The fewer things that fight you, the easier the job becomes. So a little bit of preparation. This can all go together smoothly. Get your exhaust in line. Remember, the O2 sensor lead needs to hang out here. Yep, you're on. Keep on going. That's perfect. Now, while Chris is putting... Oh, that didn't feel good. While Chris is putting that mount together, which we'll show you in a second. That's how that goes. While he's doing that, I'm going to remove the nut, the washer, and the little half moon from this. Give this stud a real good coat at copper anti-seize. If you put too much on here, the worst that's going to happen is it's going to drip off once you run the bike. I try to add a little here where that half moon presses against the clamp. Sometimes they bond together. And again, this is only done so the next time this has to come off, it comes apart easily. This clamp gets torqued to 55 Newton meters, which is quite a bit. That is a 15mm. You'll need a 15mm socket. Then we are going to route our oxygen sensor up and get that hooked up. Excellent. Route this up through here, and this one actually ran over the back into this clamp here. It's good. I'll put a couple of zip ties on that in a moment. Route this up to here. We go under. These into here. As we screw this together, it brings the plug in. Oh, I can't do that. And we'll zip tie that here and here, along with the two down here, and this portion is done. Chris has already torqued our muffler hanger bolt to 20 Newton meters. Our next step is going to be installation of the ABS pickup sensor. Take this little bolt, put some copper anti-seize on it. These do corrode into the rear drive. They are known to snap off, so save yourself the aggravation next time and get ahead of that by putting some copper on the bolt so it doesn't corrode into place. We just feed this in here as such. Carefully, there is two O-rings. There are two O-rings inside that rear drive. Take our little bread tie off. Remove our shims. Get that out of the way. Make sure these shims aren't twisted up like this is here. Perfect. Oh, goes over the top, hooks over the top. There you go. You don't need to torque this, just use your T20 driver. Get it started, screw it in, just tighten it, don't go crazy. And that's it. We're going to leave our caliper off so we can get the rear wheel positioned, which Chris is going to do right now. These can be a little tight getting past the adjustable nut for the paralever pivot. There you go. Don't forget the shim. I do support putting copper anti-seize on your lug bolts. Let me explain something. There's been some controversy about this. Some dumb fuck lost a rear wheel because he claimed he put anti-seize on them, blah, 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 blah. It's bullshit. I've been using this crap for my entire career working on BMW motorcycles. I have never been responsible for losing a rear wheel. Use the fucking torque wrench. Torque the bolts properly, you won't have an issue. However, I can tell you, bikes without anti-seize on the rear lug bolts, those bolts are often corroded, pitted, and very difficult to remove, and when you do get them out, they need to be replaced. No reason to do that. Lubricate them, torque them to 78 pound-feet, 105 Newton meters, and you won't have any issues. At least you shouldn't have any issues. I certainly haven't. Now's a good time to inspect your brake pads. There's plenty of life left in them. You're going to drop the caliper back on. Hopefully you haven't stepped on the rear brake pedal or anything foolish like that since this has been apart. If you have, stick a screwdriver between the pads and just gently work it back and forth to press the caliper's pistons back into their bores so that the pads are further apart from each other. Again, start these by hand, please. You're threading into very soft aluminum. This front one has the funky bracket. And I'll show you why in a moment. You'll notice there is a notch on the bottom of that bracket. Let's get a picture. That notch goes in front of the rear drive. This little grommet here fits into this bracket. There we go. These Allen head caliper bolts are torqued to 30 Newton meters. This you just tighten by hand. We've already done that. Done. And done. Our next step is going to be installation of our foot peg plates, connection of our switches, and we will start on that in a moment. Before you put the right foot peg plate on, remember your brake rod that goes in the master cylinder. Easy way to install this. You can just stick it up in here, but you'll notice that it's going to be kind of hard to get the rubber to fit here where it's supposed to be. So pinch it, pull it off, get your rubbing alcohol out, a little squirt down in there, slide this back up, push this into place, pull that down. Actually, let's do it this way. Fit this on first. There, that's the way it should be. Now you can put that up, squeeze the rubber into place, and that'll hang there nicely. Take your clip off. Get your foot peg plate into position. Get the master cylinder's reservoir out of the way. Take your brake switch wiring, stuff that up here for now. Try to fit this in place. I'm just going to put a bolt in here temporarily. Actually, copper's right here. Put some copper on it. There, that'll hold us in place for now. Now we're going to line up the master cylinder and get that bolted into position. pedal as needed to line up pin for the clip. Oh, I went the wrong way. Goes in from the back. There we go. That's in place. Chris is using the 5mm Allen socket to get the 2 bolts that hold the master cylinder. It goes tight. Started. Rear brake master cylinder bolts are in. Torque those to 8 Newton meters. These foot peg bolts get torqued to 18 Newton meters. $20, $18, I believe. Check your manual. Remaining electrical on the right side is going to be the ABS sensor here and your brake light switch. Brake light wire comes up here, runs along this frame rail, and then is going to curve and go up to here. Your anti-lock brake sensor lead is also going to follow a similar path once it reaches this junction. So you can run both of them through a zip tie up here. That one there. Close this up. This is going to get packed with dielectric grease, and we're going to connect these and bundle them out of the way.
This tube is sitting better days.
Simple process. Put a little in there. So a little on that one. Push it right up to the face. Squirt some in there. A little more. Good. Other way. There you go. Okay, now we're going to tuck these up there. They are normally kind of zigzagged a little bit, so we're just going to zip tie them just like this. One zip tie here. Good. Put our master cylinder reservoir back in. Now's a good time to get rid of the charcoal canister. On the left side, as I mentioned earlier, this is missing the little felts. These are relatively easy to install. Throw a little bit of alcohol on them and push it right on. And that's it. Once you do that, you want a little bit of assembly lube on that ball, just to provide a little bit of lubrication in the joint. Now we have this end, have a little linkage, and remember we need to take the clip out, which Chris has already done. Snap that into place. If I could find the hole. And you have to be careful and make sure that you actually get the pin through both holes. It should protrude out the top, as you can maybe not see there. Anyway, get that, lock that into place. We need to remove the clip from the bottom. Swing that out of the way. Go to our foot peg plate. You see here it's missing the felt. Here's our replacement felt. A little alcohol. Push that into place. A little bit of assembly lube on the ball. Now, where is the Jesus clip?
It's right there.
It's right here. Now you're going to fit this together, and this is kind of a bear to get that ball pressed in. Out of the way here. That's going to go back in the same way as the other one that I just did. Then we're going to move along, get the rest of our bolts into place, securing the foot peg plate to the transmission and to the subframe. So we are getting closer to completion every minute. You have these 3 bolts, here, here, here. Copper indices on them. Those will get torqued to 18 to 20 Newton meters. You have this bolt here, which will be 20 Newton meters. And don't forget the one hidden in the back. Right there. Remember the tab on the cover for the rear wheel that fits into the tab, the little groove in the wheel. Line it up, smack it into place. That's all you do. We are putting dielectric grease in our 3 connectors. Side stand switch, gear indicator, neutral switch. Here, here, and here, and then we'll zip tie them in place. At this point, you're ready to put the fuel tank back on. You want to make sure that your throttle cables are seated in the pockets here and that they're not hanging up like this. So make sure they're down, make sure they have full action. Same here. Make sure it's seated. Make sure your throttle turns as it should. You can install the tank, install your panels, and go for a test ride. That concludes our transmission clutch replacement portion of this video. I'll take a moment and share what we used for tools. 1/2-inch drive torque wrench to achieve 150 Newton meters and 105 Newton meters for the swing arm and the paralever pivot pins. Also 105 Newton meters for your rear wheel lugs. 1/2-inch drive standard ratchet, 1/2-inch drive breaker bar to remove the pins and the lug nuts, lug bolts. An extension. We have our 3/8 drive torque wrench, which is the most commonly used torque wrench in my toolbox. 3/8 drive conventional ratchet, a couple of longer extensions, 1/4" drive ratchet. This is a flex head. You don't need a flex head. We have the 1/4" extension. Our wrench sizes were 16, 15, 13, 12, and 10. We have our 30mm socket, which covers the lock nut on the adjustable pins for the swing arm and the power lever. Rear drive, 17mm socket for your rear wheel lug bolts. 15-inch socket for the exhaust nut. And then we have the 19 3/8 drive, which is for your drain plugs. 16mm, 15, 13, and 10. Our hex sockets are 12mm for the pins, 8mm for the fill plugs and the subframe bolts, 6mm, 5mm, 4mm, 3mm. We have side cutter pliers, which cuts the zip ties nice and flush so there's no barbs sticking out of them. Pair of 90-degree needle nose, standard needle nose, 45-degree needle nose, conventional pliers, pry bar to lever up that cable that runs around the left top transmission mount for the battery tray, regular screwdriver, flat blade screwdriver, long slender flat blade screwdriver, small flat blade screwdriver, a 90-degree pick, various other picks, your T20 Torx driver for your anti-lock brake sensor on the rear drive, 3mm ball Allen to remove and install the fairing panel screws, telescopic magnet in case you lose something, T-handles in 3, 4, 5, 6, and 8, rubber mallet, brass hammer, steel hammer, punch, map gas. This is an old fork tube. I use that over the breaker bar for a little extra leverage. And all we really have for specialty tools are these. These are those funky pliers that you need to reinstall the crimp clamps. We have our fuel hose pliers to remove the fuel lines. We have our funky cutout 30mm socket for the pins, along with the 12mm Allen for the pins. A little piece of Scotch-Brite if you need to polish something, and of course a little round piece of leather, which is what we stuck in the pivot hole for the swing arm in the transmission when we were removing the drive shaft from the output shaft of the transmission. And that's it. I hope that was informative. It looks more daunting than it really is. It's all just nuts and bolts. This is a relatively simple task, and while it may take you 10 to 15 hours to do this your first couple of times, it's a good education to learn what's inside your motorcycle and how to fix things and what to look for. So it's worthwhile doing, and you should pull this transmission every 40,000 miles in order to clean and lubricate those clutch splines. Thank you.